Welcome back. You're watching Political Exchange, where we continue our discussion with Julian Rademeyer. Julian, before the break, we were talking about the importance of journalists having the tools with which to ask relevant questions, particularly when it involves data within the constraints of newsrooms today, where we know people don't have a lot of time to check. Let's shift the focus now and go to the rest of the continent. Many institutions on the continent find themselves under pressure. They're either underfunded or the information that comes out is not really that trustworthy. How is one able to ensure that the information that comes out of countries where you have weak institutions are in fact, sustainable? If one takes, for example, a place like Zimbabwe, it has a particular image in the public perception. It's a country that's collapsing, the political situation is unstable, and so on. But within that, you have a framework where people can claim just about anything, and it's very difficult to actually make sure. One of the claims that your organization investigated was the fact that 2 million people in Zimbabwe will need food aid, and it was found that the claim was hugely exaggerated. Now, without going into the specifics of that claim, sketch how one tracks the validity of information in a country where there's already a bad public perception and where it's difficult to check the veracity of info.
I think it's incredibly difficult. We're in the process of expanding some of our operations to include some of the Southern African countries, looking at Zimbabwe, Zambia, Swaziland, etc.
Right.
And the kind of data that we have, for instance, in South Africa, doesn't exist there. The data that is available is often very questionable.
Right.
So often you do have to work with the best available information that you have, and you need to look at the claims, try and challenge them, find out essentially the first question to ask is, what is the evidence that supports this claim? And to try and test that evidence in whatever way you can, using journalistic skills or using data, what data you can find, international data, local data, AU data, any data for that matter. So the basis is essentially to look at the claim and start off with, okay, we have this claim that's been made. What supports that claim?
But what is interesting for me is, let's say in a country where you have a fragile state, where institutions are particularly weak, many people tend to rely then on your foreign agencies, your aid organizations, your NGOs, and so on. But in the case of the 80% figure about South Africans using traditional healers, that was your World Health Organization.
Yeah.
One would assume that data coming from an organization with that kind of public profile and international profile wouldn't necessarily be faulty. In states where official data is often questioned, one does rely to some extent on your NGO community, your parastatals, to give you the data. What happens in instances where that data itself is compromised or based on very flimsy foundations?
No, it's extremely problematic, because most big international aid organizations are reliant on data they source from the countries in which they operate.
Right.
So UN development data is obtained from ministries in those countries, and that's where you find these skewed reports. If you look at some of the claims that have been made, for instance, we looked at a Time magazine article recently which claimed that Africa is the drunk continent, looking at drinking in Africa. That was World Health Organization data that they were citing. But they were also, the problem was aggregated because in two senses. One is that the WHO data isn't that accurate for drinking habits across Africa and across the wide sort of number of countries and drinking patterns. The second problem there was that they took the data and they made a sweeping judgment call based on data which only really looked at a number of countries. So it is extremely problematic, and the best that you can do, and one of the things that we're trying to do there, is to try and champion better data, ways of improving data. The work we've done on crime stats here is the first step in what I see as a long ongoing process of trying to encourage better data, working on similar projects in countries like that.
There's often, in the international community, there's often the tendency to look at Africa as a country and not as a continent. And of course, that is particularly problematic because you in fact have 53 countries, very different peoples, very different habits, and there's the tendency to make these generalizations and sweeping statements. Take us through some of the kind of interesting stories or facts that you had to debunk that came up across the continent, and the origins of it and where it came from.
Yeah, well actually just on that, one of our most popular reports is the number of countries countries in Africa.
Yes.
We calculate, and it's actually something that's been read quite often, and that there are 55 states in Africa that are actually recognized either by the UN or the AU.
Yes.
If you include Somaliland, you have 56. But you get numbers reported globally, which miscalculate the number of states. So on that very fundamental level.
Yeah.
Again, if you're looking, and it is problematic. The Time magazine article was an ideal example of that.
Yes.
Treating a continent as a homogeneous entity, where it excluded the fact that you have, for instance, many Muslim states where, you know, very low levels of drinking.
Yes.
The fact that the data it was based on, the WHO data, had excluded from their Africa data several countries which they'd included in the Mediterranean region. So countries like Morocco, like Egypt, like Mauritania, like Somalia, Sudan, had all been included under the Mediterranean region.
So they were simply not African.
They were not African. And that in itself is hugely problematic. So, you know, and it's something we do see. I mean, I think there's some very good foreign reporting being done.
Yes.
But it is that homogenous approach. What's the way that people try and count stories? If you look at for instance, the Kenya situation, the Westgate massacre.
Yes.
And the way that the British press tried to turn this into an issue about the White Widow.
Yes.
Despite the fact that there's no evidence of that.
But this is exactly the point. I mean, I've been watching news reports coming out of Kenya, and all the news report says unsubstantiated claims that she is linked, and yet the story is the main story. Yeah. So if the claims are unsubstantiated, there's no evidence that links this woman to the attack on the mall in Nairobi, why does it even make the news?
No, it's a very good point. And I mean, the story there began with the Daily Mail, who were looking for a sexy headline.
Yes,
and they got
a British connection.
And a British connection to make sense of, you know, a story in Nairobi. And I think that in many ways with international coverage that is quite problematic, because there is this disconnect. I was in the US at the time of the Westgate massacre, and if you switched on to channel in New York, a local television station, you could be forgiven for thinking that nothing had happened in Kenya. You know, the lead story was someone falling off a building, if I recall.
Yeah.
So there is that, you know, unless you pick up the right newspapers. I mean, the New York Times did some incredible coverage.
Right.
But then again, you have, you know, these attempts, and it's trying to find that sort of local angle and break a story down, and it's hugely problematic.
To what extent, Julian, are people using data and organizations such as yours to push back on perceptions about Africa and about individual states? Are more organizations beginning to say, you know what, let's not be mediated through others, let's speak for ourselves, let's collate our own data and put it out there? We saw a little bit during the Kenyan election when a lot of international media were obsessed with the potential for violence, when in fact the election was in fact largely violence-free, that Kenyans began pushing back, particularly on social media, and challenging the kind of dominant narrative that were coming from places like CNN. Are people beginning to do that, and are they using institutions such as yourself to get better information and to put a more accurate picture of what is actually going on out?
I think in my experience there's decidedly a thirst for fresh information, for information that does challenge those. I mean, I see our role to some degree as a bit of a myth-busting organization. You know, we look at these cliched claims, the 80% traditional healers, for instance, is a nice example. We've looked at other claims. For instance, the BBC published or ran a report by John Simpson stating that there were 400,000 poor whites living in squatter camps in South Africa. It's complete and utter rubbish, and it's not supported by the data. We've looked at some of the right-wing claims, looking at crime stats and trying to paint this sort of victim picture that, you know, there's a white genocide going on in South Africa when there isn't. And those sorts of things. So I think it is pushing back, it is looking at that. It is also holding public figures to account.
Yes.
You know, we've had claims by the President and also by Karima and others about the numbers of mud schools in the Eastern Cape that are being replaced with new schools. And claims that things would be done by certain dates. They haven't been done by certain dates. The schools that they claim were replaced haven't been replaced. So it's challenging those claims, you know.
And it's allowing people to use data to get more accountability and to have a transparent process about planning that is essentially about their lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the crime stats, one of the biggest problems I think in South Africa is that government institutions, and that includes the police, have this impression that they own the data. they forget that that data is paid for with taxpayers' money,
Right.
that it's actually our data. It's not your data, it's our data.
And I suppose the big thing is empirical data has to be backed up by clear evidence. Julian, thank you
Yeah.
so much. That's where we will have to leave it.